Our scripture this morning comes from the Dhammapada, chapter 2. Mindful among the unmindful, wide awake among the sleeping, one of good understanding forges ahead like a swift horse. The Dhammapada, chapter 2, entitled Mindfulness. The last time we spoke, I spoke of the distance between each other and our faiths as being a thin piece of paper. It's also the distance between the cells in our body, literally about that thin, very razor edge. And curiously, it's the same distance between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Almost nothing. Razor thin piece of paper that spans 400 years. There's a 400-year gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There are some traditional online Christian sites that question, well, why did God go silent for 400 years? Okay, silent, sure, except for the Persian era, the Greeks and Alexander the Great, the Syrians, the Maccabeans, the Romans. This is when the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, the Bhagavad Gita, Confucianism, and Buddhism. Not silent, spiritually mindful and wide awake. And it's also curious that right where the Old Testament ends, about 400 BCE, before the Common Era, 400 back, right at the end of that is when was born Siddhartha Gautama. He was born in Nepal as a very wealthy prince. You might remember the story, perhaps you've read the book, Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And after seeing suffering in the streets, people dying, the nature of death, why they were suffering, from which his father tried to shield him, in fact, imprisoned him in the palace, he escaped, left his royal home, left his beautiful wife and his newborn child to find the reason for suffering. Siddhartha studied under various sects, but none of them were satisfying. And when he was 35, he entered into a deep meditation and vowed, I am not going to emerge until I am enlightened, which he did so. And then he taught in the oral tradition for 45 years after that. He was always called Gautama, never called the Buddha until way after his death. There have since been presumably 28 Buddhas, and some have achieved full Buddhahood by something quite interesting called mind-to-mind transfer, where presumably you can get to such a state of awareness that you just share enlightenment mentally with someone else who is equally aware. There are three main branches of Buddhism: Mahayana, Theravada, and Vajrayana. But those are of less importance to us, except they all teach what is called Dharma, which is the lessons of Gautama Buddha. The Dhammapada being just one of those collections of teachings. It's a series of sutras, small, digestible ideas. There is the essence of all Dharma is what are called the Four Noble Truths. And the idea is how to end suffering, just as Siddhartha set out to do. There's typically no God referred to in Buddhism, but there is a reference often to the void, to emptiness, but still acknowledging that as the source of life. So it's not so much a pit as potential, more like everythingness than nothingness, infinite intelligence. The Four Noble Truths boil down to this: what is suffering? Typically pain, being stuck in sense consciousness. What causes suffering? Typically fame, gain, cravings on a personal level. And the third being the cessation of suffering. How do we move into non-self? Now, not no self, non-self. As we said in the prayer, not one, not two. The fourth noble truth is how we go about with that cessation of suffering. How do we stop it? So as you can see, all four are just about ending the suffering. Now, the fourth one in Siddhartha's life, or Gautama's life, he found in his early life that it wasn't hedonism, wasn't living like a prince with all the wealth and all the luxuries of life, but nor was it austerity, where he nearly starved himself to death. What he found is what he called the middle way between hedonism and austerity, or what is also called the Eightfold Path, which means 8 ways we can stop suffering, the cessation of suffering. Those include the right view, right aspiration, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, and right mindfulness. I want to elaborate on that last one, mindfulness. President Claudia oddly said she wanted to change the insert to make that about consciousness and put in instead a description of mindfulness. Little did she know how apt and intuitive that was. I want to elaborate on it because we are also emphasizing that as what M stands for in AMC, being mindfulness. From the responsorial, just to remind you, mindfulness is a way to the immortal, life and only life. By means of energy, mindfulness, self-restraint, and control, we make for ourselves an island that no flood can overwhelm. A person of understanding guards mindfulness as one's chief treasure. And one who delights in mindfulness is not liable to regression. One is in the presence of nirvana. So mindfulness gets us beyond our sense consciousness, what is the cause, the pain, as the Buddha described. If we're stuck in our own selves, and our own needs and cravings, it's going to bring us suffering. Once we can get beyond that, or what they say in psychology, metacognition, where you move away from your brain thoughts and into your mind thoughts, that's the mindful step. And according to an entire chapter in the Dhammapada, that's how we start to relieve suffering as well. There's a famous story. When Gautama started to wander around India shortly after his enlightenment, he encountered people who recognized him to be a very extraordinary being. And they asked him, "Are you a god?" "No," he replied. "Are you the reincarnation of a god?" "No," he replied. "Are you a wizard then?" "No." "Well, are you a man?" "No." "So what are you?" they asked, being very perplexed. Gautama simply replied, "I am awake. I am awake." He did not say, "I am a god, I am a man, I am a wizard, I am a medium, I am a minister." He just said, "I am awake." And as you probably know, Buddha means the awakened one. Nothing more. We may not have quite achieved full Buddha awareness, but we are awakening, my friends. Just like in the photograph of the famous Washington sculpture on the front of today's bulletin. The person coming out of the ground, called the awakening. So, quite honestly, when I hear the politicization of woke or anti-woke, it just spiritually makes me shudder at our naivete. But after I calm down, the ignorance reminds me of what it really means. And it's not a trend, and it's not a meme. It's 2,500 years old. The awakening to spiritual truth can never be confiscated by any political agenda. It's a spiritual truth, first and foremost, and one I strive for, to be mindful among the unmindful, wide awake among the sleeping. Or in pop culture, may I be woke and stay woke. And the lesson here is, it's in the awakening that we see the root cause of suffering and where we find the simplest remedy of all. It's the essence of Buddhism. Compassion. When we are awake, move out of ourselves into non-self, not one, not two, we find compassion. Compassion towards others, compassion towards self. And how I like to say it is, if you ain't got compassion, it will just lead to suffering, like a cartwheel following the hoof of an ox. So I don't know about the Akashic records of all of you, or your soul progression is, but I sense that many of you are finished or nearly finished with your karmic debt, just by your presence, your energy fields. That will leave you with an interesting set of choices between your next lives, or the bardo, as Buddhism calls it, the space between lives. Do you take a break? Do you pursue other planes of existence? Or perhaps voluntarily return to earth to help others by way of compassion, what they call a bodhisattva, where you could go on, but you choose to come back and help others. In Western terms, service. Whatever you choose for the next phase of your spiritual journey, be mindful among the unmindful. Be wide awake among the sleeping. For you of good understanding will forge ahead like a swift horse. Be woke and stay woke. Blessings to you.